like to also express hope that the United States can hold an objective view on the issues in the South China and East China Seas.
Since the arrival of the Chinese oil rig in waters near the disputed Paracel Islands earlier this month, Beijing and Hanoi have each sent vessels to surround it. Anti-Chinese protests in southern Vietnam, which erupted Tuesday, spread north, and the foreign ministry there has confirmed one death from the clashes.
There was China, that tiny little country nestled in the Far East that we all know has the best interests of America at heart, if not their hands all over our currency and debt, of course. Hey, the Chinese quite often do things quietly, as if not to draw much attention to what they're doing, which in this case is a classic land grab, even if there's no land to grab. Welcome back to MidPoint. Retired CIA operations officer and president at Orion Strategic Service, Charles Faddis joins us. Charles, thanks so much for being here today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
This is a fascinating story. As I noted, the Chinese like to do things very quietly, not to really draw a lot of attention to themselves. But in the South China Sea, they are attempting to build land. Tell us a little bit about this and why, because you have to believe right away that there has to be something militarily involved here if the Chinese are doing it.
Right. So the Chinese have staked out a claim saying that basically virtually all of the South China Sea belongs to them, which is historically unsupportable. And as you've noted, you're talking about a body of water. So what they've done now is they have started building islands, which they are declaring Chinese territory and on which they are putting military installations.
All right, let's look at that from a military basis now. How strategic are these? Where are these in relation, I guess, to other countries, and what, in your opinion, would they be immediately used for?
So the South China Sea basically extends south from China to Indonesia, west to Vietnam, east to the Philippines, speaking in rough terms. What's the big issue? The big issue is that there are immense oil and natural gas reserves under the South China Sea. And by turning this into Chinese territory, the Chinese have effectively just grabbed all of that oil and natural gas for themselves.
Is it fair to say that the Chinese, though, are a government that if the United States gets involved and says, as they have, we'd like you to reconsider this, that the Chinese pretty much will thumb their nose at the Americans and say, have a nice day?
Yeah, I mean, we have expressed, not particularly strongly, but we have said on numerous occasions that we don't agree with this. And they've effectively told us to mind our own business and continued. This project they have underway to build islands is huge. I mean, they have these giant vacuum dredges out there sucking up the bottom of the ocean and spraying it up onto coral reefs and building islands all over the place in the South China Sea.
Is it their territory? If you were to look at a map, and again, here we're talking about ocean. I know we're just talking about water, but technically, map-wise, is this their territory?
No, I mean, the thing is that they have no historical claim upon which to rest at all. I mean, they have advanced them, and they're completely unsupported historically, and nobody else recognizes them.
So then, why are they allowed to get away with it? That would be the initial question.
Well, the first reason is because the immediate neighboring nations obviously are all militarily inferior, and none of them want to get into a shooting war with the Chinese. And we have done nothing of any effect to stop them. In fact, ironically, we just invited the Chinese to participate in what's called RIMPAC, which is our largest annual naval exercise in the Pacific Ocean. So while all this is going on, we have Chinese ships operating with American ships in the Pacific Ocean, which you've got to imagine sends an interesting message to people like the Filipinos.
Is this sort of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink, though, that the Americans kind of give the Chinese because we are so deeply in debt to them in so many ways? Let's just talk financial and start right there, that we are willing to let them get away with a few things that might not seem to be a big deal to us. Might be big to others, but certainly is not a big deal to us.
Well, I don't know if it extends to that level, but certainly the fact that we have gotten ourselves in bed with them economically to the extent we have means that any major confrontation with them is going to have huge consequences, and therefore raises the threshold on our side and makes us that much more reluctant to rock the boat.
What does this mean to Vietnam? Because we let off with a segment right here that talked about the tensions that are going on here. How is this going to exacerbate things?
Well, for the Vietnamese, for the Filipinos, for everybody, effectively, I think the way they feel right now is they're completely on their own. And the Chinese are not being subtle. They're not just building islands. I mean, they have boarded other countries' ships. They have in the past fired on other countries' ships. I mean, this is, you know, they have made very clear that if you don't get out of the way, you're going to get hurt. So the Vietnamese have to tread very carefully.
Would you have any doubt then that the islands that they're building here are going to be used militarily, that there will be some sort of, whether it be ships, whether it be dockage facilities, or whether it be some sort of missile facilities here? What's the end game?
Well, first of all, they are already building military bases on some of these islands, so that's already happened. But one of the islands that is sort of, if you will, the largest project, they have publicly proclaimed in China, they have described it as a super aircraft carrier. So they have expressly told the entire world that the purpose is to put military aircraft on this so they can control the South China Sea.
The interesting thing I saw recently, too, was that China, their leader went to South Korea and decided not to go to North Korea. There seems Chinese would have normally sent someone to North Korea. The leader would have been there, perhaps first. Is this really a snub? But what's happening here between China and North Korea? Because certainly, I mean, these are two countries that we have to watch very carefully in the grand scheme of things.
Well, you know, the Chinese and the North Koreans have kind of a strange relationship. I mean, obviously the Chinese make it possible for North Korea to exist, but North Korea also goes off on its own and exhibits a lot of bizarre behavior that the Chinese are not always 100% on board with. So this is a way of them trying to remind the North Koreans that, you know, you are the tail, we are the dog, remember your place.
Where is China seeking to take their own relations, not only in the region, but certainly with America and with the rest of the world? Because as I let off and talked about this, it is fair to say that still the Chinese are still a little bit mysterious to us here in America, certainly in the West, where many times they do things we don't pay attention, we don't seem to understand them, and many times we seem to almost, again, it's that nudge and a wink here right now. And again, I come back to that whole end game thinking, but where is China going in the changing of how it is perhaps changing its own political aspect and what it's looking to do with other nations?
Well, you know, I think what you're touching on is that the Chinese tend to think in terms of long-term and an end game, whereas we tend to be more in sort of soundbite mode. And the Chinese are expanding their power, and they are pushing themselves out and asserting much more control and influence in the surrounding area. And it's not necessarily going to happen all overnight in one dramatic moment. It's just going to be continuous and relentless. And until somebody makes them back off, it's just going to continue to spread.
But is there anybody who would make them back off?
Well, for instance, you have seen recently that very recently, the Japanese formally announced that they are changing their doctrine in terms of how their military can operate and where it can operate. The Japanese have bumped heads with the Chinese several times recently in the East China Sea, and they have sort of absorbed the lesson that we're not stepping in. And so they're clearly saying to the Chinese, okay, so we are going to begin to take steps militarily that we have not taken since the end of the Second World War to stand up for ourselves.
We know the Chinese are economically very powerful, but again, you touched on it briefly, and I wanted to touch on it again. The military strength here, again, something which we don't pay much attention to. How strong is this military if you bring them up into 21st century technology?
Well, the Chinese military is not a match man for man or technologically for the U.S. military. But on the other hand, they're not right now trying to project power to the west coast of the United States, for instance. They're trying to project power within relative proximity to their shores, within several hundred miles. And they are developing some pretty scary capabilities to help them in that regard. For instance, they have recently tested a ballistic missile that is specifically designed to destroy U.S. aircraft carriers. They even built a mock-up of a U.S. aircraft carrier out in the Gobi Desert, which is what they tested it on, just in case anybody missed the message.
How worried should we be that as the Chinese continue to build new weapons and the ballistic missile you mentioned, that one day it will come to bear against the United States or our interests?
I think we should absolutely be very focused on this. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. But for instance, in the case of Taiwan, the only reason Taiwan has not been formally occupied by the mainland Chinese is because of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. We have effectively guaranteed the existence of Taiwan as a separate entity. Once the Chinese are in a position to push us back and change that equation, then all kinds of things can happen.
All kinds of things will happen, and as I noted here at the top, we have to make sure to keep an eye out there, because while the rest of the world kind of gathers our attention, we cannot let the Chinese kind of get very far from what we're looking at in the world theater. Charles, it is always a pleasure to have you on the show, my friend. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful 4th of July.
You too.
It is something that we have to watch. It is something that we will watch right here, because quite frankly, trust me, the Chinese are watching what we're doing. You can always tell us what you think on social media. Always a way to get hold of us on Twitter, email, and Facebook, and then we'll talk about it here, because this is the Newsmax TV network and MidPoint, where we question everything.